Hello, everyone, and welcome to Books Undone. I'm your host, Livia J. Elliot, and today we have a meta guest talk with none other than Amy Minton, who you met in my spotlight of her debut book, Discovery. Before we dive into today's theme, Amy, thank you so much for coming back to the podcast.
I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Today's theme is that Amy is not only a talented writer, but she also completed an MFA in creative writing. And so today's discussion will focus more on the craft. Specifically, we will be talking about focal distance and multi-timeline stories in first-person tense. As a result, and as a brief disclaimer, please note that we may mention some relevant short stories and books, but we will try to keep spoilers at a bare minimum. In any case, all the books that we will discuss will be listed in the episode description. To get us started, would you like to introduce the concept of frame narratives, multi-timeline stories, and the overall setting of the books that we are going to be discussing?
I'll do my best. When I was putting these definitions together for you, I noticed that these are all books that I really enjoy reading, or these types of narratives. So it's no wonder that I was attracted to them to write about them in a thesis. To start off, we have framed narratives. This is a literary technique that places one or more stories inside of a primary story. Some call these nesting doll stories. An example would be Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This is when the captain of the ship is exploring the Arctic ice and finds a man on a sled and where he shouldn't be. This man is Victor Frankenstein, and then the story goes into Victor Frankenstein's story, who tells his story of creating a creature. And then there's a third nest in Mary Shelley's work where the creature tells his own story. So you have a story within a story within a story. There's a 3-layer in that one. Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness does that. It's 2 frames. David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas does it. If you like a more contemporary look, that's 6. If you like movies, that's done there too. It's done in Princess Bride with the grandfather telling the story of the bride of the fairy tale. Citizen Kane is another example.
In fantasy, you also have the Kingkiller Chronicles with the name of a wind, that you have one framed externally in third person, then the narration in first person past tense, and then within that narration, some characters tell another story.
Yes, the technique is far older. It became popular in the Gothic era when Mary Shelley kind of brought it back, although some would argue some others did it first. But that's when it became very popular, the turn of the screw. And so it's basically you're sitting around a fire at night and it's like, I've got a good story. And then you tell like the biggest story that just knocks everybody out of the park. And then you come back at the end and everybody around the fire is like, oh boy, that was a story. That's basically what it is.
It also has that feeling that makes you, by giving you the frame, sometimes it inserts you into the second story or the second layer in a different way than if you only had that layer of the story.
That's true. That gives you a bit of perspective. It gets you context. It also can hype up your excitement level by saying, "Oh, this is a bad story. Let's especially if it's the Gothic era and you want that kind of kind of creepy feeling." That happens in Turn of the Screw. And Heart of Darkness, you'll get the, boy, this was the worst time I went to Africa, and so it's like, oh, settle in, everybody. It's going to be a big one. Going to be and so it gives a bit of a context, and it gives a bit of focal distance, which we'll discuss in a minute. And so it kind of like slides you out as a reader, so you can kind of hover over the whole thing with a bit of a detachment before you dive in.
Sometimes one gets affected by the biases of the narrator, because and that happened on the short stories that you mentioned on your thesis that we can discuss later, that when the narrator is also a character that starts introducing layers of bias and prejudice, and sometimes they try to trick the reader into perceiving the story differently.
They do. That point makes me think of of Heart of Darkness when in the middle of the narrative that Marlowe is telling that somebody on the outside interrupts him and says, "Oh, be civil." He gets a little slap on the wrist from somebody on the outside saying that that's not how you want to talk about that. And then Marlowe goes right back into the story. So I always found that kind of interruptive feature really interesting to say there is a bias, just a tiny little red flag on the field, just to remind you that this narrator is biased. Yeah.
Yeah. And I really liked it on the story. It was Alice Munro's story that she will have those commentaries between parentheses that will sometimes change the opinion of what will come or actually make a comment over the narration of a main character. It made me remember of The Name of a Wind in particular, the one that I mentioned. You have the main character narrating the story, but at the same time, he's actually a famous character, and some people on the bar don't know that he is a famous person. So I start retelling the same point from a completely different and exaggerated perspective. So at the same time, the story is giving you like 2 points of view on the same fact. Which bias is actually real? It's a very interesting play.
Well, then we could go in the other concept we'll be talking about, which is the multi-timeline stories. It's a bit more frequently done, the literary technique that weaves together two or more distinct storylines set in different periods. And this is a bit more than a point of view shift. It's a temporal and a psychological displacement from the storyline that's been going on before. Some of the examples are like Cloud Atlas, like I just mentioned. Emily St. John Mandel does this a lot, like a Station 11 and Sea of Tranquility. Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut does this. Some of the classics do this, like Odyssey, Sound and the Fury, Wuthering Heights. Most of the ones that I just mentioned above, all of them have one timeline going, and then there's a shift that goes back in time and a complete psychological distance between that two. So, and we'll get to that at another point of focal distance about how to actually really shift away from that timeline. Make sure you're completely detached.
In those cases, I think one point is that the character is also a narrator. So especially when you have the multi-timeline, you have the same character, for example, a younger version, which is a quote-unquote protagonist of the embed story, and then the older version, which has that psychological distance, which is narrating. So you have at the same time two versions of the same character that are co-living and co-telling the story. And something that I always think when that happens is that how faithful is a representation of a younger character? If you think of it as we telling an anecdote, for example, of 20 years ago, are we going to be faithful to our 20 years younger self?
No, we have the lens of experience. Yes, we have the lens of experience and wisdom and other things that have happened to us in our lives to reflect on that. But we'll get to, hopefully, when one is writing about why you don't want to necessarily leak that into your story. Because although that is something that we do as humans, like I might tell you the story, for example, of a very embarrassing incident that might have happened to me when I was maybe 6 years old. But I also might defend myself, or I might say, well, it's because it was a bad day and all of these. I was too young. I didn't know any better. Then I behaved very badly. So my present self might tell the story as a defense. It might tell it as an accounting. It might be incredibly honest in another way. I'm just like, it goes too far into the self-deprecation. But as we're writing, and we're going to get into why you need to separate those two, and you need to keep your character version faithful. So we'll explain in a minute.
That also leads us to the interplay between the author, the narrator, and the character, because the author will have both versions, the character version and the narrator version. And that also can create some subjectivity and some problems when you are writing it.
Right. So when you have a first person narration, and sometimes this can be third, especially when it's in film, like The Princess Bride, there's not much first person per se. It's very detached. You're sitting in an audience. So it doesn't necessarily have to be first. It's usually first. And I believe in my thesis back in 2007, now look at me doing this. I'm pulling focal distance saying, now when I was in school, I probably didn't, because I was really attracted to first person narration. I probably didn't consider how this happens in third. So my present self will now put up a flag and say, I think there may be some room for exploration exploration there. So we'll talk about what I just did there. That there's an author, there's an author, a narrator, and a character. And this concept was introduced, or at least put down in writing for the academic world to see, by Frederick Reichen in his essay, Author-Narrator-Character Merge. Sometimes it's called ANC, Author-Narrator-Character Merge. So the example would be that you, Livia, have written a book and you are the author. It is narrated by a character also named Livia, which tells the exploits of a character long ago also named Livia. So what you have are three versions of yourself. And when you think about it, when you're writing, there are three versions of yourself in front of you. This is all coming from your imagination, and you, Livia, the author, are in control. So what Frederick Reichen is arguing in his essay, that each of these versions of Livia must be imaginatively separated, that the fictional construct of other must exist for every single version of Livia here. This is what's called narrative distance between the three. If you reduce these, for example, and do what we just discussed, where we say, now I'm going to, as an author, kind of make myself look into a little bit of a better light here. I'm going to introduce maybe some of my own wisdom here. This is closing the narrative distance, and the reader is going to know it. Just like your best friend when you tell that story when you're 6 years old, going like, uh-oh, she's defending herself, or this might be a little different. So the reader will know when you're doing that. So keeping them separated is kind of the work of the author, to tell that story faithfully on each level, for you as an author to be completely detached, for the narrator who's looking at the events to be completely detached. Kind of get everybody out of the way for that character to fully enact the story. That's what we're looking at with the author, narrator, character. And now when you merge all of those, that's where you kind of get into trouble. That's what beginning writers can do. I certainly used to. When you start writing, and you start writing a bit of maybe like a semi-autobiographical piece or something, trying to make sense of something in your life, you might not be separated from that narrator and from that character, simply because you're not aware that this kind of psychological thing is happening in your writing. So awareness is the first step, and then you go from there, right?
Yeah, definitely. And do you think that's more easily achievable by plotting, or can you do it with the classical punching?
That's such an interesting question. I think you have to do it on every single level that you write, because it can leak in almost everywhere. You have to be constantly aware, if you are writing this type of story, that you're going to have to separate yourself and you have to check yourself. I think you always have to keep an eye on that character, that one that's the most distant from you as the author, to make sure that they're playing out their life completely. Another example of this is Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut. It's not all in first person. I just realized this yesterday, that Kurt Vonnegut, as an author with experience in World War II, which was widely known when he put this book out, that he went through the Dresden firebombing as an American. Anyway, he was in the services, and he was a prisoner of war in Dresden when that city was firebombed at the end of World War II. There's an external frame that's in first person that sounds a heck of a lot like Vonnegut, talking about how he came to this story and how difficult it was for him to write. This first person frame seems to be told from the author's point of view. If one is trying that, it reads Vonnegut and says, I think I'll try that, I would advise that you read what Vonnegut's doing there and how well he separates himself from that narrator character. The narrator Vonnegut and the author Vonnegut are very distinct, because this narrator has an extreme focus. It's not going to bring in his grocery list from the day. It's not going to bring in any other stray thoughts, maybe not even defending himself, but it's almost like this third layer of allowing that narrator to have room to tell the reader how difficult this story is to tell and what's at stake in its telling. Definitely, I don't know this for sure, but when one is reading this, one can say that this story is an excellent portrayal of post-traumatic stress disorder, which, if anyone has gone through that, knows that there's a lot of weird narrative distance that happens in your own head. For him to be able to pull that off while having that own experience is quite the feat, to not get involved and to detach oneself. Now, in Slaughterhouse 5, the majority of the novel goes through character third person from the point of view of others, but Billy Pilgrim is quite obviously really a stand-in for Kurt Vonnegut, who has become unstuck in time. So he's time traveling, he's going back and forth. So you have the multi-timeline story. It's really a brilliant way of portraying what it's like to have post-traumatic stress disorder, because you can get unstuck in time. Your brain just goes from here to there to here to there. And sometimes you go to these very interesting incidents in your past and you have to let that portray out and run out, and you don't know exactly why you're there. And then you'll jump to your present. And so anyway, all of this to say that this jumping around that Kurt Vonnegut does in Slaughterhouse 5 is a really excellent thing to look at if this is what you want to do, to portray a semi-autobiographical event in your own life. Now, that's not to say that Kurt Vonnegut actually did the time traveling and whatever. He's making an artistic representation of what it's like to have this and what it's like for other people to be so frustrated with him. I think that book is absolutely brilliant. It hasn't aged well in some ways, namely its feminism, but it's there are other things to take away. Other things.
Yeah, part of what you were saying in there, it reminded me of Mouse. I'm not sure if you have read it. Yeah, you have the author Art Spiegelman telling his story as he was getting the information from his father, and then within that, the story of World War II. You have all of the representations of PTSD from the dad, who basically doesn't understand what he has, and then the younger version of himself, of the author, within the story, who also doesn't understand what's happening or didn't make the connection between both of them. But at the same time, he wrote that up quite after everything that happened. So there is also that separation in there, and it's a biographical thing because it's a story of his father.
I was going to say there's another World War II novel that does this. It's City of Thieves by David Benioff. It's something we talk about. Talking Story is our YouTube channel. I got the host, John, my husband, to read that story and fall a bit in love with historical novels that way. That also has the frame narrative, very similar to Mouse. It's a grandson this time asking his grandfather about what it was like to live through the siege of Stalingrad. So we have a first-person external frame, and it goes into the story, which is something that the grandson was not present for. So that's interesting. But you do have that external frame to say it's been told to him. So you have a level of authority. He's a bit closer to the story than us, but he wasn't there. There's some things he has to make up.
That basically means exactly what are you missing up? Because he may be able to relay facts to some extent, but not as much as emotions or everything that happened in the mind of the person that was there.
Exactly. And in the external frame, he actually says that the author says to his grandfather, or one may assume, I don't know, this could have been an invention of conversation as well. Maybe this is a really distinct author-narrator situation here, where it was like, he's making this up. What happened to his grandfather came to him very differently. We don't really know. What he does say, I think that's incredibly interesting, is that at some point he was asking his grandfather so many questions about the time period, and the grandfather, either from lack of memory or from stress or from just being tired of his grandson asking, says, I don't know, you're going to have to make it up. That's when the inner story starts. So that inner story does start with a bit of a license offered by somebody who was there that says, take the torch, tell the story. I've given you all I'm able to give you, and now it's your turn to tell it, which I think is a really beautiful moment. Not only does it give him license, it gives him authority, and it gives this intergenerational touching moment that happens that kind of ties into the story at the end. I will definitely not spoil that, but it was a well done moment that I would encourage anybody to take a look at. That City of Thieves by David Benioff. Such a fun story about the siege of Stalingrad. I have no idea why, but he did make it. He has a fabulous voice. I think that's what it is. And yeah.
And something of these stories is that by getting those multiple perspectives, you also have a narrator who is, as we mentioned before, separated in time. And I loved it that you called it the narrative perch.
Yeah, the narrative perch it gives you a little bit of a visual about where the narrator is in the story. It's just like an overview. They see more. If you think about maybe like a bird in a tree and a perch, it's like they see more, but they're not in the action. So it gives you as a writer a really distinct job as far as where the narrator is. You're there to keep the focus so you can see the boundaries of the story. If you think about yourself up high as the narrator, you can see the boundaries. stories, you can see what's important. You can see from your perch in the future. You can see with your wisdom that you've gained from them about how to look back on the story. Use all of those things on the narrator's perch to oversee the events. If you want to get into focal distance, that's when you drop down off your perch and go into the story itself. And that's where, when we discussed before, things can get a little hairy. they can go, they can get biased, to be more specific.
And you can start breaking the rules as an author, because that means that you can start blending things that happened before and making commentary, like one of the stories that you mentioned here did. And that's something that I really loved in your thesis, because I have seen stories that do it differently. You have stories that sometimes separate it clearly on a scene or something. So there is a formatting cue for the reader that we are getting into a story within, or you have a different chapter. But these two that you gave me, they were blending in at some point. For example, the one from Joyce Carol Oates, I love that one. You had like that opening that even seemed omnipresent, and then you get an anchor point, and then a comment that is in first person, like in the fourth or fifth paragraph or something like that, but then it moves back again and it's playing with that focal distance all the time. I love the point that you mentioned about making it accessible to the readers by giving them grounding points that could be like the blank space and the formatting, or sentences, or concepts, or even anchoring moments like you analyzed on Joyce Carol Oates' story with the bicycle and the racing and the flying.
Yes, these grounding points are like, if you think of yourself again as the writer who's like on the branch of the tree, and here's your narrator, and you dive back in, at some point you're going to want to dive back out. This is what we call the focal distance. To mix the metaphors, it's kind of like, sometimes it's a camera zooming in and zooming back out, and this can be disorienting for the reader. I was like, am I in the past? This is the narrator-character merge that could happen when the reader doesn't know which one is speaking. If there's any bias or any judgment or any wisdom introduced from the present, it needs to be very distinct to the reader. That can be, like you said, like a paragraph break, a chapter break, or whatever. But these two masters, Alice Munro and Joyce Carol Oates, they could do it in the same sentence. They can do it and bam, you're in and you're out. But you as a reader know where you are. How do they do it? And so that's where I was looking into what is called grounding points. To look at that, in the thesis, I look at rocks in a Zen garden. If you think about how a Zen garden looks with its pea gravel, its tiny little gravel with its that you can rake into waves, or maybe it's sand that's all around these bigger rocks that interrupt the flow. If you think about the narrative points, and you can use that as like a focal distance to say the story is the flow that's around these rocks, but these rocks help center you to keep your eyes on this field of meditation, which is in this metaphor, the story, and as in rock garden, it's your actual meditation. Another one is like rocks in a stream, where you're trying to cross a stream, and it's the same idea that the water is the story flowing around these rocks, but you as a reader trying to negotiate this river, to negotiate the story, need these rocks, these landing points to kind of get across. So if you think about those rocks, those grounding points in a story for focal distance, they can be way stations, orienting landmarks, focal points. This helps with the disorientation. Like you said, you can use blank space, a chapter shift, another formatting change. Some people, will change their fonts entirely, especially if there's a letter or something that's being introduced. It's like, oh, a typographical shift. So that's a formatting change in the text. You can go with some concrete ways. That's what Joyce Carol Oates was doing. I have a sample to read from Stephen King. Stephen King loves to do this, loves to do grounding points and focal distance. And Stephen King was really my first introduction. He really does love a first-person narrator, and he loves his voice. He loves to exercise voice. And if you've ever read Dolores Claiborne, you might ask yourself how an author like Stephen King has ever channeled himself so well into an old lady in Maine. Dolores Claiborne is entirely told from first person and does those narrator shifts in timeline. What Stephen King loves to say, now that I've gone through all of this, I look at it and go, oh, here he goes again. He loves to say, if I knew then what I know now, And he likes to say it at the very beginning so that you know you're in for a story, but you also know that there's value in this lived experience. There's value in the story itself. It signals to the readers like, oh, some people really changed. There's some wisdom here. So the narrator is wiser when it gets to the heart of a great story and what people love about a great story, which is change. And Dolores Claiborne, this older woman in rural Maine, goes to the police station on her own account for a murder in the town. And she's telling a story to three people: a deputy named Andy, who she knew when he was younger, a chief named Frank, whom she hates, and a stenographer named Nancy, whom she relates to as a woman working in an all-male field. And she's there to confess to a murder, but not the murder they think that she's there to confess. And this happens in the first few pages, not a spoiler. So in the first few pages, I want to show you how Stephen King moves narrator focus and focal distance using grounding points. Okay, here's Dolores Claiborne. Yes, Sandy, yes, I'm going to tell it. Jeez, Lee Crow, you ain't never shook the ants out of your pants, have you? Tell you what, I'm going to compromise. Instead of telling her front to back or back to front, I'm going to start in the middle and just kind of work both ways. And if you don't like it, Andy Bissett, you can write it up on your TS list and mail it to the chaplain. Me and Joe had 3 kids, and when he died in the summer of 63, Selena was 15, Joe Jr. was 13, and little Pete was just 9. Well, Joe didn't leave me a pot to piss in and hardly a window to throw it out of. I guess you'll have to fix this up some, Nancy, won't you? I'm just an old woman with a foul temper and a fouler mouth. But that's what happens more often than not when you've had a foul life. Now, where was I? I ain't lost my place already, have I? What Joe left me was that little shacky place out by the East Head, 6 acres of land. Now, I'm going to stop right there because you got the shift. She's a little bird on the tree, dives down into the story and goes right back up and then right back down. So how Stephen King is going to do this, he's also setting this up for the way this is going to work the rest of the novel. She's talking to Andy. She mentions in the first chunk, she mentions Andy twice. Yes, Andy, I'm going to tell it. And if you don't like it, Andy Bissett. So every time she interrupts, you think as a reader, she's going to use one of these names. These 3 people have already been introduced in a very memorable way in the first page and a half. It's voice heavy. It's a little bit funny. She dresses them down a little bit. So you know in your mind as a reader who these 3 people are. Now, when she dives back in, she says, me and Joe had 3 kids when he died in the summer of 63. Then she gives the ages of her children. You're noticing there, all of this is concrete. These are verifiable facts. They had 3 kids. He died in the summer of 63, how old their children were, how much he left her. And then, boom, she zooms right back out.
Yeah, and it's also a clear shift to past tense as well, because in the first one, it seemed more present. I'm going to tell you. In the other one is, we had 3 kids.
Now, when we said that some people might say, oh, I'm going to have a blank space here or a chapter break, where Stephen King gives us nothing but a dash. And then he goes like, boom, right back out. I guess you'll have to fix this up some, Nancy, won't you? Because I got a foul mouth. So there we go. She booms right back out. She does it with strong voice. She calls her Nancy. She's addressing her directly about her job. And then she dives back in. Same paragraph. When Joe left me with that little shacky place. So we're back to Joe. We're back to verifiable facts. What he left, where it was on 6 acres of land. So you see, he's doing a lot of work here to be able to do this all in the same paragraph. This is all in the same paragraph, even though I paused a lot as a narrator here, saying, between these breaks, because I just really wanted you to hear or just to remember that this is all the same paragraph. And as a reader, you can pick all of this up in a flash. These are all of the psychological tricks that are going on in our mind that Stephen King is flagging.
Yeah, we could say that in these stories, basically the flow of time is completely fluid for the reader, at least.
It's very fluid. Yes, isn't that great? Isn't that great? If you've seen the movie Dolores Claiborne, and some of your listeners might, it does confuse time. She's there in her small town, and it has the present tense has this kind of grayish filter. She might be looking at something that might turn into a vibrant color, and all of a sudden she's in the past. Now that's pulling focal distance in a completely different art form, but it's still the same thing that Stephen King is doing. It's just translated into film. And it kind of gives me chills because it's like that director really, really understood what the heart of the story was, like looking at your surroundings and seeing something and then just sliding back into that time period. It's just a lovely little trick to get all of your, anchoring. It takes a lot. Yeah. It seems really easy, but you can master it by studying how people do this. Because in first person narration, where all of these conditions are present, everything that we've mentioned in this podcast, from nesting stories to multiple timelines to first person narration, if you think about these kinds of stories that you really love, I can guarantee you that the writer is doing this, and it might be doing it in a different way that you can really look at and really study and go, I'm going to try that. And you just break it down.
But in those cases we were mentioning, like the Joyce Carol Oates or the Stephen King passage, that's the same paragraph. It requires a different type of nuance and clues that are perhaps a bit more vivid as well, because you have less to tell. Sometimes you have a single sentence or half a sentence in one timeline, the rest of it in another timeline.
Maybe so. It differs based on your artistic intent. I mean, what are you trying to say? In Dolores Claiborne, Stephen King is trying to say all of this is coming back to haunt her. So all of this is going to be very, very present for her. So he's going to try to shove as much in a paragraph as possible. And Dolores Claiborne is, as far as novels go, it's not a novella, but it's quite a quick read. It goes very fast. The pace is very fast. I don't even think it's broken up into chapters. I'd have to think about that, but it does give me pause, because if I have to think about that, that means that if there are chapter breaks, they're not, I don't recall them. And isn't that interesting in itself, that there are no breaks? It's just going to be this old lady in the police station, like a almost like a transcript. And that's exactly what the sample is. It's Nancy's transcript of what happened inside the police station. Yeah.
Another one that I can think of is the famous The Garden of Forking Paths by Jorge Luis Borges. So you have the first two paragraphs, which are a context, where the work comes from. And from there, it starts like a frame narrative, the recording or something from an interview from a person who starts telling the events that happened. But as the story goes, basically, the past version of that character and the narrator starts blending in for a plot reason. I'm trying not to spoil. And at the same time, because this is a recording of the interview, he's using footnotes, but the footnotes belong to whoever analyzed the recording and not the person telling the story. So you also have that extra information.
I love it when that happens. I love it when that happens.
He used footnotes a lot. So it's pretty interesting, because when you read the first time, it's like, wait, who put up the footnote in there? Because it's a 10 pages story. By page 5, you probably forgot about the 2 first paragraphs that were telling you that this is an interview. There comes a footnote. At the same time, within that narration, the main character goes on to tell the story of his grandfather. So within the narration, you have a third, fourth layer of another narration. Again, that's a case you mentioned before, somebody telling a story they didn't live, but was suddenly related to the current events in the story. That's also a different style.
I love the surprise. Yeah. The surprise layer is almost something like when you get a cake and that's just like something in the center of it. It's just like, ooh, a little jelly center of the cake. It's a surprise. I love the surprise narrator popping up in before they've been introduced. David Mitchell does this in Cloud Atlas. I remember reading that first section for the first time, and there's a footnote. So stole the technique from somebody. Wait a minute, one might say, when I did when I read it. It's like, who made this footnote? And what are they talking about? And what? Oh my gosh! It was like it's reminding you you're reading a document. But that little footnote, that was anyway. That's another grounding point and a focal distance shift. definitely kind of falls into the category of text formatting, but it's just a little bit different because it's outside of the text, meaning, oh, somebody is looking at this. And isn't that interesting? And it kind of brings this voyeurism into effect. And you've just realized somebody else is in the room with you. I don't know. I love it when that happens.
Yeah, it's a different technique as well. Another one that I can think of is the Book of a New Sun. That's a frame narrative. So you have present time character telling the stories of his youth and how he ended up in the current situation. So it's a bit fluid, not at the style of King, but somewhat fluid. However, when you reach the appendix, it's the author saying that he tried to translate these books, but he may have failed because we don't have the most accurate words. And so makes an explanation of, I tried to approximate this and this, but there aren't any descriptions of this and that. Depending on the theme of a book, you get a different appendix, sometimes discussing weapons or sometimes discussing the destroyers, which are some type of horse. And once you get to the appendix, you realize that there are, let's just call it 2 layers of linguistic relativism, that the character, the young version of the character, doesn't have the vocabulary to explain it, but at the same time, the author is telling you that he failed to translate accurately.
So the author just added a different level of author, like just added at the very end too. Isn't it brilliant? Isn't it brilliant?
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
I love it. I love that book in general, but once you get to the 4th book and you understand some of the revelations there, once you come back, you start realizing the clues that you couldn't find at the first time because the narrator, even though he's on that narrative perch, he's still trying to be honest to his own depiction of his youth. Yeah, it's brilliant. It's brilliant.
I love the device because it gives so much texture and so much depth to any story. It's just such a simple thing to do. Although when I really look at it and all the time that we've spent talking about it, it was like, well, maybe it's not so simple, but it is simple when you read it. I mean, like Stephen King is kind of known for his like simple narration. He's kind of a straightforward dude, and he can do it. The guy's been writing for decades, so don't write him off, and consistently. So every time he says he's going to retire for some health reason, nope, he's back, and he's got a big chunk of a book. So that's what he does is that he writes. So you have to pay attention to everybody who has that kind of volume and that kind of success.
Also, this type of narration that we are discussing, it's not easy to achieve, but it's also a matter of practicing.
Practicing.
Give it to your beta readers. Practice again.
Yes. Give it to your readers and understand that it really is in their power to tell you as a writer whether you've pulled it off or not. And just be very sensitive to that. Just like, did I do this right? You standing completely outside of this. Did I zoom in correctly? Did you understand where you were? Did I zoom out correctly? Did you get that? And you can do it a couple of times. You'll get the hang of it. Yes, it's a fabulous device. It's a fabulous technique.
And it can add so many layers of richness. And circling back to something that we mentioned before, and this is something that I'm particularly interested because bias is always a theme in my own writing, and how the bias of that present time narrator affects the past time narrator. In your thesis, you discuss that you can add overarching comments so the character or the narrator can try to affect how the reader is perceiving the story, and that changes the mood of the story.
When I was in grad school, I was listening to a professor, an instructor, trying something in his own work. I don't know if he pulled it off or not. He's an Italian American, and he was thinking about a first person narration where his Italian mother would interrupt his first person story to set the record straight. And which is like, come on, that's precious. I mean, but it is, it it is, just that, I don't know. I've always like kind of sat with that for years and wondered if he was able to pull that off and how that looked. It's almost kind of like first person omniscient, but coming from another direction. If this woman knows a bit more about your own story and your own lived experiences than you do, and she keeps insisting on herself in a first person story, I think that's, first of all, hilarious, and second, really inventive.
Yeah.
So there you go. It can go both ways.
In that regard, something that I wanted to ask you in particular is that many of these stories, when you get that blending of a present time narrator and the past time character, you also get quote unquote spoiled by the narrator, because sometimes the narrator will tell you this is something that happens. And I have a quote from Heat by Joyce Carol Oates, which is the one that you did on your thesis. She says, "That was the summer before seventh grade when they died. Death was coming for them, but they didn't know. You just got introduced to the two characters that are going to die." But that also sets the mood. It shifts the point from what happened to how it happened.
Exactly. And not only that, that's another focal distance trick or technique, is to remove any sense of mystery about a certain aspect of the story. So if you're going to outright announce a death like that, it creates a new sense of drama, and it creates another layer between you and the reader. It moves from, oh, this is not about what happens, it's about how it happens, and it's about how it's still affecting the narrator. Because in that sense, where we talked about before, the way Stephen King loves to say, if I knew then what I know now, you wonder, how is this affecting the narrator? What change did this story bring about in her? And that's how Joyce Carol Oates just changed that meaning, the meaning of the story, by spoiling it, by saying, yeah, these two girls are going to die. Because the how it happens and how it's still affecting the narrator is the focus of Heat. That's how she, as an author, just said, I'm going to remove this as a focus, the fact that it does happen. I'm going to decide on the outside that this gets removed. So that's my job. I'm going to have the narrator say it, and then bam, and then I'm going to show the why and the how it affects.
Something that she does that I found it both fascinating and enervating as a reader was that she spoils this bit and then goes back to the present time. When she comes back to the past time, it's like, okay, I'm going to find out how they died. No, she advances the story minimally, goes back out again. And it's not until like the last page or so that we end up finding what happens. But that way of pulling in and back all the time, knowing what happened, knowing that it's about children, it creates a different level of tension.
Yeah, she's really going to frustrate you on that account. And it's a 3,000 word short story. It's very tiny. She has to do this with a lot of economy. So that frustration that happens when she pulls focal distance like that, just in and out and in and out, and it goes from one sentence to another about where she is. It's going to be about this. No, it's going to be about this. And it's going to be, and it doesn't, there's a little bit of a level of frustration, but there's also a level of trust developing because of the economy, because Heat couldn't be anything other than a 3,000 word story. This is not a novel. It could be, but with the focus that she's put on it, she's like, I've got to get there really quickly, almost as quickly as these twins riding a bicycle and speeding down the road. I've got to move fast because I can't abuse the reader's trust too much. So when you're feeling as a reader that authorial intent, you feel that speed of the narration and you feel the focus coming in. It's like, okay, I feel a lot of trust as well. I'm going to get something out of this story, even if you're like one page in and going like, I have no idea what it's going to be, but it's going to be serious because we're talking about a very serious situation here. You know, it's going to be good.
At the same time, it feels incredibly personal for the narrator in this case, which I think we never find out how she's called. Whenever she comes back to the present, she's always making a reflection or a comment. And in some cases, there are also these sentences that you highlight. I think they were very few, like 6 or 7, in a second person, like, you never know, that type. And she uses you in some cases to make a reflection in the way we will do it. When we are thinking or speaking to another person, we will use the same verbal tense that she did there. That creates that, at least to me, that feeling of this is actually a person telling something that happened. And it's a regular fiction, not a speculative fiction. And it makes it even more, oh, this could have happened. And she makes some reflections on that tone during the story, which exacerbates a feeling. So it's very meticulously done in that sense.
Yeah, she also uses a perspective shift. She goes from collective, like she'll talk about the we of the town. We thought this about the twins, and this happened to us as a town. And then when that shift happens to the present tense and she says, I don't see that very often. Usually if the we happens and the collective tense, that we stay there. But when we go to to when it was like, now I'm going to talk about it's like, oh, something is happening on an individual level as well. This happened to the community and it happened to the individual. So something distinctive is also going on. So there's 2 layers of trauma happening in 3,000 words. I mean, come on, that's amazing.
It's incredible. And also because I love that part in your thesis where you made that little plot of every time she goes back to a different time within the timeline. And it ended up being like 6 or 7 different points in time, like just before the murders, the day of the murders, during the funeral, which is how it starts. And then you have a few more up to the present time. And as you say, 3,000 words. It takes mastery to actually do that.
Yes. And you think about it, it was like, wow, that takes a lot of guts. If you were to tell that story from start to finish in chronological order, I think it would be rather dull. But it's almost kind of like she cut all of those paragraphs up and just threw them up in the air and how they landed. But that's not how it happened either.
Yeah, especially because this is a lot the reader, especially around the how. And it's not explicit a story. So if you're going into it expecting to be described how the murders actually happened, you're not going to get that. But the ending is nonetheless satisfying and in tone with the character, because the character is the narrator is during the whole story trying to make sense of it. Even if you want like a more clear-cut ending, but the narrator character doesn't, you need to go for the open ending, perhaps.
What I find fascinating about Joyce Carol Oates and her exploration of that was that there are things in life, and boy, do we hate this as humans, that we just can't know. When you're looking at the murder of the young girls, as she did, there's a desperation in humans in general to know what happened, why it happened. And there is a limit in her story. And it seems to be the whole point of the story to say that I don't know. And she teases us with an almost first-person omniscience of what's happening. And you might even say as a reader, so I was like, wait, how do you know this? The killer didn't say, and the girls aren't living and nobody else was there. How do you know this? And then just when you're aware of that as a reader, she pulls back and says, no, I wasn't there. I don't know. And it's like, oh, that's, aha! I still struggle with what that story is really about. I think it is sometimes about how trauma affects a person. And then I don't think that. And I think it's the pain of not knowing what happened to these girls, the mystery, and how much that hurts you to not know what happened.
And perhaps how the narrator tries to fill the gaps because
Yes.
of the idea that by understanding you can make the pain less painful.
Yes. Sometimes when I ask people about just a story, just like, tell me something about the past, maybe like in City of Thieves, how David Benioff says that to his grandfather, I want to know more. I want to know more. And the grandfather will cut him off and say, that's all you can know. That's all there is to know. That's all I can remember this many years later. This is all because it's so much trauma in there, this is all I can tell you. It's all my brain will allow me to tell you. And then what you have and what you're left with at this focal distance is it's like a thorn in the side that just doesn't ever go away, and a nagging mystery that can't ever be solved unless you take pen to paper and you try to solve it and reconstruct it. And that's what a lot of these focal distance exercises are just like exercising that thorn from the side, that mystery that's been there this whole time. I think it's just a lovely human thing to do, to try to work that out and try to provide answers. And damn, Joyce Carol Oates just at the end just says like, well, I don't know.
And then you're, damn
you.
When I reach the ending, I literally say it out loud, like, what?
Why don't you? What? But you were doing so well with a reconstruction. And then, she just kind of gives up and says, I wasn't there. Really?
That's the other point. If we shift to the reader on this type of stories, this type of narrators with that fluidity of going back in time, they are also towing the line of frustrating the reader. And by that frustration, pulling them back, you have, as a writer, I think that you have to be very precise with your audience tolerance to that frustration, because at some point, if it is too much, they may just DNF.
Yes, that happens. I know that Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell will frustrate readers after part 1 because he just stops. And there's a reason for that. As a reader on the outside recommending that, I have to say, persevere. It will pay off, I promise. But sometimes I give it to people who will just DNF after that. It's like, that's a nasty trick. He just stopped stopped mid-sentence. And I was like, oh, but you have to push through. And yes, that's a risk. Frustrating the reader is a risk. There was another one that I wanted to bring up to you. I thought of Patriotism by Yukio Mishima. It's a 1961 story. This one up front tells you everything that's going to happen in the story. It's bold. I remember a writing teacher gave this story to me and says, here, read this. You're going to hate it. And I said, why? She's like, no, just read it. And I didn't. I think she caught me just at that period of switching my admiration for this Joyce Carol Oates, just like, I'm going to announce everything that happens in the story, and it's going to make it about why and how instead of what. What happens at the very beginning is like maybe a newspaper journalistic summary of what happens. Like, you're going to read about this event that is in the story in a newspaper. It's that cold and it's that distance. And then the distance starts shifting and you start getting into the life of what's happening. And it's about the Japanese ritual disembowelment, seppuku. It's about when a Japanese officer commits seppuku for some kind of infraction. Well, right away, that's the first sentence, like such and such disemboweled himself. And I was like, that's a captivating sentence. I was like, oh, really? And after you get through the full journalistic story, who, what, where, when, why aspect of that, and then you start switching into the story and you think, how can I feel this about something I already know what's happened? Well, anytime you read a newspaper story and you as a reader wonder, who are these people? What's happening? Why did this happen? How did this happen? And what's the warning for me as a reader? Where's the lesson for me in this as someone who's standing outside of this, and as someone who reads stories to say, I'm just trying to figure out life. I'm just trying to figure out the meaning of life. What does this person have to teach me? And sometimes those newspaper stories just don't quite get there, do they? It leaves you more wondering, and it puts the, Joyce Carol Oates says, that thorn of the mystery in your side, and you have to work on it. So yeah, that's what patriotism does. I think more successfully than Joyce Carol Oates, because it's not as frustrating an experience too. It works on that thorn in your side. And so it puts the thorn in there and gently removes it as far as satisfying your knowledge of what happened. That's a different way to jump in and out.
Another book you made me think of, it's a novella by an indie author, Thomas J. Devens. The novella is called The Dregs. He does the same thing, but into the future. You get one chapter following a character, and they are in the aftermath of a very bloody battle. So you get this character, you follow them through an event, and in the next chapter, it's actually a poem or a song romanticizing what happened in that prior event that you just read. So you get the original point from the character, then you get the poem. There is no connection between them, but it's the same thing throughout the whole novella. So you get one point of view, and it gets very grim because it's a grim, dark story. For example, you may see a character doing something very cowardly, then you have the poem making them be It's amazing. You have no context when the poem is, how many years have passed, but you get the legend and you just saw the facts. That is why it's into the future. It's very well done. Yeah.
I love that. What a great idea. What a great idea. Now I'm thinking about that. That's so cool.
His prose and the poems are also very nice, with the rhythm. And I think it's in the contrast between both of them that the theme and the richness of a story comes in, the theme of how cruel is war, how the truth of the events gets distorted.
Probably a bit of the history is written by the victor kind of thing going on there about, see how elegant, that's just so elegant, such an elegant way to bring focal distance to enhance your own theme. Very elegant. Love that.
And I think you used it as well on Discovery on your book when you have...
Oh, did I? Oh, good.
Yeah, especially on the first chapter when you have everybody on the newsroom, that they are watching the videos, and then you suddenly stop the story, go into the video, and then you come back and have all the shock, but you did it on third person.
Isn't that funny that, I didn't realize I was doing it. I think I've been doing it for so long that I just knew it had to be done. Sometimes the only way to understand a story is to back off of it a bit, temporally and psychologically. And sometimes the only way to understand it is to introduce some mystery to it, to define the limits of what we can know. And that example is there's a videotape and you can only see, what this person filmed. So the focus is very tight. And what that person chose to film could be not what you really needed to see to really understand that event. That could be a completely different story based on, it has the same ending, but it's a different, it's a different story on the human side if somebody else were filming that. So, yeah, yay me. I did that. Yeah, okay.
I thought that you actually played with that frustration very well.
Oh, thank you.
Film will always end up when I was just like, no, you can't end there.
Yeah.
And then come back to the present. And then the present, I was just like, no, you can't go end there.
You have to read some really good people. Like we've mentioned all of these really great writers. You have to read them and understand from what's come before you, how far you can push it, how much you can frustrate your reader. That was a decision that I made about frustration, that I was going to try to push it really, really far. And I did hear back for some readers who was like, this is really far. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I really am asking a lot of you. I know that. I hope that it pays off. That's the interesting thing, is because we have a Discord and we can see how people react to the book. I can see when people are frustrated, like they'll actually tell me. It was like, boy, I'm on part 5 and I don't understand. And I was like, yeah, it's frustrating, isn't it? Keep going. Yeah, I definitely wanted that to pay off for people, just to say, well done. You sat through the frustrated. And unlike Joyce Carol Oates, I'm going to give you a big cookie for it. I didn't have the heart to do what she did.
At the end of the day, that cookie or that reward for the reader, it also ties back to the theme of a story. In Heat, it actually worked, having the cliffhanger. It's, as you said before, why are you telling me the story to end up like this? And asking that question as a reader takes you back to the theme. In other cases, it's just, as you did on Discovery, more just to keep the mystery going while having the impact in the present at the same time.
Yeah, it can definitely, in the case of Joyce Carol Oates, depending on how much you frustrate and how much you give the cookie at the end or the reward, is like how much you're going to really reveal about how life works. It's not just about like the death of these twins anymore or what these people discovered on this videotape. It's about how life works and how it can be frustrating and you can't ever really know. That's just a really fascinating way how Joyce Carol Oates elevates a 3,000 word short story to be about how some mysteries really just can't ever be solved. And all by just saying, I don't know.
Something that I actually didn't realize about that story until a few days after I read it is that while I was reading it, the whole story seemed to be about what happened to these two sisters, the two children that died. But once I finished it and I started thinking about it, the more that I thought that the narrator was a main character, in the sense of what this is a story that she told herself to make peace with whatever happened in there. So what demons is she fighting by telling me this story? It's a weird case of readers focal distance giving another meaning to the story.
And you would think, kind of in lesser hands, so I would just be like really tempted to put that little bit of the narrator in there and about how she's really kind of messed up in the present tense. And you get just a little taste of some of the behavior that she's ascribing to not knowing about this event that happened. And not only just the twins being killed in a violent way, ? We don't even really know. But going through all of this, but like the reactions of her parents, the reactions of the family, and all of this, and the fear and the threats of violence that happened in the aftermath of it. Like the father of the twins wanting to go over and take another life from that family. That's been all of that tension that's going on in the community, how that creates a person in the present tense who's doing the stuff that she's doing. That's frustrating to me as well, because I wanted to know more about her. Like she gives just a little taste of how that affected her, but not a lot. You don't know a lot about this narrator. Again, frustration and bravery on the author part. Yeah.
Bravery, definitely. And I think it goes back to what you mentioned very at the beginning of the episode. As an author, you have to take that step back to know exactly how much information to put up, because I think that if she had added more information about the present narrator, the story would be less rich in terms of themes and execution. So I think this type of a story and this type of narrators, the less is more.
Yes, yes. And you're more willing as a reader to slip yourself into that when you know less about that present day narrator. You can say, I've been in situations where there's been a collective trauma that most people have, a murder in a small town, a natural disaster of some kind, or a war, or something. Most people have had that experience in their youth of having some major thing happen to a community. You're more willing, I think, to put yourself in that situation and imagine yourself there and imagine the pain of some of the mystery, especially when you're a child and this is happening and you can't understand the full ramifications, or you can't ever understand, all of the facts involved, especially when there are adults who won't tell you or newspapers who won't tell you. Part of the casket, she says the lower half of the casket was closed, but the upper part of the body was open. So that's how she knew the damage was on the lower half for the twins. And that's such a deadly detail, but it's all she got. It's all she got. And she just grabs onto that. And I was like, wow, that's so intense and so real.
She's never explicit because it's not a description. There is nothing. It's just a passing comment. And if you're reading without paying attention, it's very easy to go past what that could mean. And that's also what adds to the horror side of the story, to say it some way. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And she doesn't even really quite know what the murder weapon was even. She's like, well, it happened in a nice house. Could have been a nice pick. We don't know. Wow. I'm going to make a story about the murder and I'm not going to tell you exactly what happened, how they were killed, the murder weapon, or, just not really anything about it. Yeah. Job giving you nothing.
Nothing.
Yes. Yeah.
Just a bunch of suppositions.
Yeah.
So to close off, do you have any tips for any writers that want to dare to try this?
To dare to try it, I would say go for it. I would say read, fail and fail better is the greatest thing that you can do when you're writing is to even try it. I would say find some really great authors, some masters, and take a look at how they do it. Really take it apart. Take some of these tips that we've given you about author, narrator, character, merging and separation, making sure that each one has a distinct identity and you're not letting anything filter through any of these levels, except when it's time to shift focal distance and you're a little birdie on the branch and it's time to dive into the story, that you leave the reader that trail, those rocks in the river to come back down and come back up. All of those techniques that we talked about in grounding points. Understand that your narrator is going to have bias, but your character is not. Their character is still in the past and really determined and really, so keep everything separated. Talk about some of those focal distance tricks that we brought up towards the end about go ahead and what happens if you spoil your story? What happens if you just tell everybody outright, this is what's going to happen? Is it still a great story? That's a really great exercise to give it a shot to see, So I would just say fail and fail better. Keep trying. Watch your masters. Use your techniques and keep working.
Yep. And keep frustrating your readers and learning how to do it.
Yes. Frustrate us. Do you see how much we're banging the table over Joyce Carol Oates and over 3,000 word stories? Like, frustrate us. We want to know, we'll tell you when you've gone too far, but
practice makes a master.
Definitely do it. Practice. Yes, it is.
To close off, if you like this episode, please check my Substack at liviajelliot.substack.com. I post weekly literary analysis pretty similar to what we discussed today, and they always have examples and practical writing advice for speculative fiction writers. As a bonus for subscribing, you will get the free ebook of my novella titled The Genesis of Change. It is not first person, but the narrators have a way of blending in, and you may find that interesting. You may enjoy it. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.